I am here with Barrett Brown, somebody who defies easy description. We are in the headquarters of D Magazine in beautiful downtown Dallas, and Barrett has mercifully just been released from the confines of federal prison, and he has a lot to say about that endeavor. The circumstances which led to him being imprisoned are pretty convoluted and complex. And so the first question, which is sort of necessary, is although I'm sure you are a bit weary of recapitulating the details of the case which led you to being imprisoned, can you just do that in a perfunctory way that sort of synthesizes the most important aspects of it?
Absolutely, I can. So I was a journalist, and I got involved with the Anonymous movement back in 2010 when the Tunisian Revolution started. Things sort of proceeded from there very quickly, and there was a hack done by certain anonymous figures against a company called HB Gary Federal. This is one of these intelligence contractors that does surveillance and dirty tricks for the U.S. government. From that, we unveiled this conspiracy to the DOJ had actually helped to instigate to go after journalists and activists, particularly those who were sympathetic to WikiLeaks, in ways that would have been illegal if you and I had done them. From that, I got in this long-running battle with these intelligence contractors and the federal governments that eventually led to my arrest on charges that turned out to be very flimsy for the most part, had to be dropped. Eventually, I did plead guilty to a couple of things that I kind of did, but not really, and did about 4 years in prison. Now I'm out, back on the streets.
And should note here that a lot of people were concerned and diligently following the details of your case while it was underway and while you were in prison, so we're all very happy that you're out now here on the outside.
It was a very bizarre case with a lot of aspects to it, some of which did get, I think, properly understood, some of which are still waiting to kind of get the due attention. There's a lot here that, beyond issues of, linking, which is one of the things that came up, whether they can criminalize linking and whether that might have very, very long, harmful repercussions for the future. There's issues here about, to the extent the rule of law exists, and at what point you can point to a system and say this system is no longer valid. There's issues here pertaining to how the FBI can conduct itself and get away with it. There are issues involving this intelligence contracting sector which never really got, I think, the full force of attention that it needs to get because of what they're doing and the ways in which they fundamentally strike at information, how information flows, how we become aware of wrongdoing within our government. So there's a great deal here that still needs to be revisited.
You were in prison from September of 2012 to November of 2016, is that right?
That is correct.
Okay, so over 4 years, and the crux of the government's argument, at least initially against you, was that you had disseminated stolen information unlawfully, which amounted to your posting a link in a chat room, and now that occasioned some blowback in terms of governmental overreach, and people were saying this sets a disturbing precedent for freedom of the press and so forth. So they did sort of retreat slightly on that, although there was a twist where they kind of marshaled a form of that charge against you afterward. Just explain how that aspect went down.
The bulk of the charges originally, even though my search warrant, when they first raided me, pertains to this HB Gary firm that we'd exposed, as well as our site, echelon2.org, which has now been moved, but which contained our information we had assembled on this intelligence contracting industry, even though that was clearly their emphasis, what they were interested in, illustrated further by the search warrants having begun after this HB Gary incident, after we'd exposed their wrongdoing. They rested upon the Stratfor hack and a later hack to charge me on. And what had happened is, after this hack had occurred of this company that also works with the government, and on which I was expecting emails to be brought to the anonymous chat room by the hackers, one of the links they pasted into the chat room ended up going to credit card numbers for the company's customers. And before I realized that, I copied and pasted that link into my chat room for Project PM, which was the group of journalists and researchers that go over these issues, and asked what was in it, and they said, oh, it was credit card numbers. I'm like, oh, okay, that's not what I was looking for. This is all in the chat transcript. It's very clear, you know, what I was doing and what I wasn't doing. Anyway, so for copying and pasting that link, which I never opened, never downloaded, which had already been available for a couple hours, and I was charged with 11 counts of aggravated identity theft, carrying a minimum of 22 years in prison on top of whatever time would be handed down on other charges. So I was facing a couple decades for most of that period. Finally, they had to withdraw those charges for a number of reasons. But of course, that helps to bring attention to the case itself, which previously was very poorly understood until this happened. Then it became clear that there were things at stake here. Had they managed to successfully, had I pled guilty to those charges when they offered me a deal on it, it would have given them a new toolbox by which to prosecute people on the same basis they prosecuted me, on the basis of they're doing things that we don't like, may not be illegal. The things that we want to prosecute them for may not be illegal, but you know, we're going to do it with this new ability we have, the ability to hold someone criminally responsible for something they link to, or possibly something they link to which links to something else. That had an extraordinary effect on attention to the case. Researchers who specialize in these issues, you know, some of them came forward and said, hey, this is too dangerous now because of what they're trying to do. Now, eventually, although they dropped those charges, when the sentencing phase came in, they used what they call a sentencing enhancement, relevant conduct, to put that same conduct back into my sentencing and hold me responsible for them. Again, this was despite just extraordinary, you know, range of reasons why that was a bad idea and why it, you know, was illicit, you know, and unlawful. There was a great deal more of the case that you know, with different issues that kind of coalesce around this larger theme of attacking journalists, attacking activists, but that's the gist of it.
And given that they did use that tactic during the sentencing phase, can it be said that now that so-called linking offense is enshrined in precedent, or did the dropping of the charge in that phase of the case mean that the precedent didn't come into effect? Well,
the dropping of charge was sort of the victory we were waiting for before we pled, because had I pled to them the actual crime there, that would have made it much easier for them to use that as a precedent. Now, I don't know exactly to what extent them being able to use it in a sentencing enhancement, to what extent that, you know, can be used later on. I just don't, I'm not sure that's widely understood at all at this point. There's a lot of sort of vagueness to how these federal laws actually get executed on the ground, regardless of how you might interpret them. And that's because, you know, the FBI and other federal authorities and prosecutors in general have a great deal of leeway, not just in interpreting or misinterpreting statutes, but also just in engaging in misconduct, engaging in outright misconduct. And that's one of the larger issues here that my case helped to bring to the fore to a small extent.
And at the time, did you get the sense that external pressure and some of the criticism that was coming from media outlets had a tangible effect on the government's decision to rescind that charge? Was that apparent to you?
Well, it's possible. I mean, there was so much fundamentally wrong, just not just with the long-term repercussions and the morality of it, but just in the way the statutes were written, did not describe the actual conduct. As in, to get specific here, they you know, said I had the identity theft statutes require you to take someone's ID. Now, these were credit card numbers. ID is defined in the statute as a government-issued ID. Credit card numbers aren't issued by the government yet. So the statute was fundamentally misused here, and that's something we pointed out in a motion to dismiss. And 2 days after we filed that motion, they dropped the charges. So, on the other hand, there was obviously a great deal of outrage internationally, but given some of the other things that have gone on in other cases similar to mine, given how much outrage there was in those cases as well, I don't think outrage expressed is enough to deter these people once they get started if they think there's a reason for follow-through. In my case, they were very, very anxious to get me locked up and put away for a couple decades, mainly because of the stuff they were originally investigating with the search warrants, the H.B. Gary case, all these incidents in which we had rather effectively taken these stolen emails from these rather criminal contractors and showed what was going on in a way that hadn't been available. Before that hack of H.B. Gary by Anonymous, there had only been one article about the intelligence contracting sector, which has ballooned in the last 15 years and which is engaged in, from what we can tell just from this slice of data, extraordinary array of criminal and indefensible attacks on our very democracy. Information operations, black ops, surveillance done, on a private sort of consultancy basis by all of these companies that are unaccountable even to Congress, even in the most, sort of the soft degree of oversight that the NSA and CIA supposedly gets. Though that doesn't even apply to these companies. And we've seen the mentality behind them. We've seen what they do and what they can get away with even when they get caught. So they had plenty of reason from a policy standpoint, from the standpoint of their mentality, to come after me, even if it involved taking a hit in the public perception area. What they did made sense from their standpoint. How they did it was the execution was the problem.
Right. So one issue among many that your case raises is that of prosecutorial overreach, which has long been a problem. And you should just probably note here that your history and the circumstances which led to you being charged with these things is so multifaceted that we can't plausibly get into all of it here. But I do think it's probably pressing to focus on the prosecutorial overreach aspect, because that went relatively uncommented on over the course of the Obama administration. I mean, there were isolated cases where, yes, it did raise a bit of a furor. But now, as we're moving ahead into the age of Trump, it's not unforeseeable that prosecutorial overreach could be ramped up. So, I mean, what lasting lessons just about the nature of prosecutorial overreach do you think people should take from how you were treated?
There is, as established by studies that have been done in the last few years by a couple of universities, taking 2,500 cases as a data set, looking at all these cases in which prosecutorial misconduct was proven or sort of relatively proven by virtue of the cases having been vacated, the sentences having later been changed by a judge because of that misconduct. Of those 2,500 incidents, about 40 of those resulted in a reprimand for the prosecutors in question. None of them resulted in any actual consequences that we would look to and say those are consequences. We have not given our prosecutors or FBI or our police state in general many reasons not to engage in misconduct. And on the other hand, the way our system is set up, they have every reason to hide evidence, to lie, to indict family members, as they indicted my mother, in order to put pressure on the defendant. And it's something that's kind of gone, it sort of evolved slowly over time, and there's never been, because our news is event-driven, there hasn't been the right events to really bring that attention and thus get Congress going on it. That's a fundamental problem that even goes beyond prosecutorial overreach, which is itself a fundamental problem. But this larger problem of we can't even pay attention to how our nation is governed unless something amusing or interesting or crazy happens, and then suddenly we get a period of media coverage, and out of that can come move for change. That has to be changed. We have to start channeling the potential among our citizenry to drive change in ways that we haven't really done before. And now that we have the internet, now that we're getting to the point where we understand how people can be organized, how they can be self-organized, how these movements can work, we need to start with more intentionality, studying that and putting it into practice.
Yeah, and there's a distinction to be made, right, between prosecutorial overreach, which is not necessarily misconduct. Maybe it's ethically wrong, but it's still, by the books in terms of what is it within the prosecutor's power to impose on a defendant. But what misconduct could result in the dropping of, not just the dropping of charges, but it's supposed to result in a reprimand. So something that is overreach isn't necessarily misconduct, right?
Right.
So there's some. It's a whole another realm of potential wrongs that can be inflicted on.
Right. So on top of the misconduct, that actually violates what I call ethics or policy vis-a-vis the DOJ, you also have on top of that just poor judgment that we could kind of count it. And that's another wider problem.
Punitive judgment.
Right. It's you can see examples that pop up, in the news, and you get a glimpse of how this, what this consists of, and in what ways they overreach, and it really comes down to personalities. It comes down to there's certain kind of people that become prosecutors in our system. There's certain kind of personality traits that are encouraged. There's certain kind of behavior and decision making that you know, in another system that was perhaps better better assessed by our own people or by our legislators, you know, would be sort of been tackled at some point. We are now getting to the point of the past couple of years where, you know, of course, our Attorney General a few years back came out and said, you know, this has gone on a little too far. We need, you know, we're handing down sentences that don't make any sense. And there have been a couple changes in the sentencing enhancements for drug offenders, for instance. But it hasn't done enough, it hasn't really done much to dent the prison population, which is, you know, what comes out of that. You have this large prison population, sort of a permanent prisoner class in a nation. And among the, you know, the people we have in prison are a very small subset of those who break these consensual laws we have. If we were to enforce all the laws on the books, you know, the drug laws, the prostitution and gambling, we would be a gulag state beyond anything in history. So our viability, our continued survival as a republic or even a nation is dependent on us not enforcing our laws, which is an extraordinary fact of our civic life that needs to be addressed at some point, you know, hopefully soon.
Yeah, and that should probably provoke a re-examination of the very fabric of the republic, right? If it's the perpetuation of the republic is contingent on the non-enforcement of laws, which are supposed to undergird the republic, maybe there is something fundamentally awry there that really necessitates a full-scale systemic reevaluation.
Yeah, and we need to look, I mean, this technically all of this, I mean, the people have the right to criminalize all kinds of things and then forget about it and just let these things continue until these institutions deteriorate, until people are victimized on an extraordinary scale, and then they have the right to ignore it and forget about it and not care about it. So we have to, I think everybody at this point, especially with what's happening now, has to look and say, at what point does the fact that we have a constitution, the fact that there's a general following of the procedures in play, at what point does that not matter? At what point does something else supersede our institutions? And we start to think, how do we deter this? How do we deter our own government? And how should we regard our own government under these circumstances? You know, there needs to be more thought about, you know, some of the fundamentals here, and that's, you know, again, that's one of those things that may come out of the Trump administration. These things that kind of get glossed over when we have someone sort of more photogenic in office, more, you know, morally sound like Obama, who's still overseeing horrible policies and horrible institutions that he could easily change using his executive powers if he wanted to. Now we have a real opportunity to see actual change.
So you spent the entirety of the 2016 presidential campaign in federal prison, which ultimately may have not been the worst place to spend it, because there were a lot of people who spent it in the prison of their own mind, just because they were so wrapped up in the daily hysteria that they kind of lost sight of the fundamental issues that really were being navigated there. So how did you perceive what unfolded from where you were located? I mean, information seeps in, obviously, to prison. I mean, within that context, how did you understand what we were seeing happen?
You're getting a different framework. You're getting different. Yeah, you're getting different influx of information, much different than I would on the outside. And I can't really evaluate to what extent I had a better seat for those elections just based on that. It's hard to say, because I'm not sure what the experience would have been on the outside. The funny thing is, the 2012 election, which was the first one I had been arrested a few months before. You know, we were locked down in our cells, you know, that night, and in the morning I could see the TV, which was turned to Fox News. And the way I knew that Obama had won re-election was because Fox News was showing this footage of these Black Panther guys standing outside of a polling place in Philadelphia, and I figured, oh, Obama must have won again. With this most recent election, you know, I don't think there was really much to see in a fundamental sense. I mean, you know, you get the gist of it pretty quickly. Look, this guy's saying crazy things, and he has aroused the fascist elements in this country, the reactionary elements, just the sort of the low information voters, the low morality voters, people who, because of their own economic problems, are willing to overlook just abject disregard for decency. You know, that I don't have a great deal of sympathy, as many Democrats do, for the downtrodden, to the extent that the downtrodden are potential oppressors. That's why I've never been really a populist. That's why I was never excited about the 99% slogan from Occupy Wall Street, because that 99% includes a great deal of police officers who will happily beat you and lock you away and violate your civil rights in ways that even many of our plutocrats won't do, although they do enable it. We have to remember who the enemy is, and the enemy is anyone in this country who has no regard for the rights of others, and that can be a much more substantial, much more relevant enemy than anything abroad and any form of terrorism. You know, there's been a lot of glossing over of our divisions. Obama is very guilty of that. His greatest piece of nonsense that he was in the habit of repeating was that we are one nation, and we worship an awesome God in New Jersey, and we show tolerance in Missouri, and that speech he gave in 2004.
There are no red states. There
right.
are no blue
Though
states.
there are very much red states. I live in one of them, and I've dealt with the cops in the red states ever since I was a teenager, and I can tell you that that the states differ, and that's a fact that has to be taken into account. We can't gloss it over and pretend it away and hope it'll be that because we play pretend that these things will heal over. We've seen what can happen. We haven't seen all of what can happen yet, but we will.
Cops in New Jersey are not walking the park either, so maybe there is some.
Or in New York,
there.
yeah. I used to live in Brooklyn, so yeah, they're all,
Yeah.
Anyway.
So after the election, there was this push to try to evaluate whether legitimate grievances that animated some facet of the Trump voting base were legitimate, or at least should be treated with some degree of empathy. That doesn't strike you as a worthwhile endeavor, or does it?
Oh no, absolutely not. They should not be. The fact that they are suffering in a first world sense, because they've lost their jobs in the automotive industry. These were the same people in the 90s for the most part. I don't want to say all of them, but for the most part, who when things were doing well and they could still have a high-paying job, without having a great deal of skills. They were happy with the setup. They had no problem with capitalism at that point, or crony capitalism, or whatever it is that we have in this country. They were fine with that. Now they want to change the rules because they're not doing so well. To the extent that they're willing to, and this goes for both parties, because obviously we had a degree to which people were willing to overlook human rights abuses under Obama because he was going to get us universal health care. And then oops, he didn't get it. And you'd spend 8 years apologizing or pretending away the assassination of a 16-year-old Yemeni American. Now his sister is dead as of yesterday, and now that's getting attention, which is good. It's good that we have some of the Democrats back on our side in terms of civil liberties, and we look forward to dealing with them on a piecemeal basis. But the people who are fundamentally unsound in their morality are fundamentally unsound. And to the extent you want to deal with the fundamentally unsound, we've just done that. And we have Trump as president now because of that, because we've been letting the dog eat at the table for too many years.
Would you regard it as similarly unsound in a moral sense to just sort of capitulate to the Democratic establishment, which was represented this past election by Hillary, and just kind of acquiesce to her program? And would you put that impulse in a similar category to what was observed among the Trump voters? Yeah,
sure. And there's two processes that have to happen here. We have elected officials who are reasonable people who can try to do what they can from that position to prevent horrible things from occurring. At the same time, we can't put our eggs in that basket. There has to be a great deal more attention paid to how citizens, capable citizens with moral centers who want to know what the facts are and care about the facts, how they channel their energies in effective ways. We have a long history of protests that, sort of blunt instruments in the way we execute them, marches and that sort of thing. These things can work, and the protests over the last few days have done a good deal to I think address this issue from the at least to the extent that you can as a private citizen. But we need to look at finesse strategies, and we need to look at what's been effective in the past, and we need to build upon those things, and that's what I'll be trying to do for the next several years with the pursuant system.
So people talk about the resistance now, and we've seen that manifest over the past couple of days with these mobilizations against the Trump quote-unquote Muslim ban policy and other aspects of the Trump agenda that people object to. And one of the upsides that we were postulating of a Trump presidency as opposed to a Hillary presidency was that it would enliven certain elements of the populace which had been relatively docile under Obama to become more engaged. And that wouldn't necessarily justify a vote for Trump, to be sure, but it is a potential product of Trump being in office rather than Hillary, that you have people now much more motivated to become active. Is that the way you see it? Is that something to be optimistic about?
Either the Trump years will be a disaster, or it will be the impetus for something necessary, and that will depend entirely on us. It will depend on the extent to which we start looking at how we can use the current environment, with the internet and the information age, the fact that any individual can now collaborate with any other individual without mediation for the first time in human history. All of our institutions come out of the limitations on collaboration. The fact that you had to work with your people in your village or in your country, that's all to some extent gone. And we haven't really integrated that new reality into how we handle politics, how we pursue change, and how we pursue activism. Anonymous and things of that nature were some of the first early steps in taking that reality into account and acting on it. And it was a haphazard process. There's some lessons to be learned from it if you look closely about what to do and what not to do. But at any rate, we can take that same agility and that same ability to integrate large numbers of capable people and get them working on a project, get them started doing something useful, even dramatic and wholesale. And we can take that and we can make it a little bit more rigorous. And that's exactly what I hope to do over the next few years, to provide a tool that people can use, and in the same way they've used these tools to spend more time talking to their friends and looking at pictures. Take that same connectivity and turn it into a political weapon, and that's what has to be done. I mean, there will definitely be movements, that will rise up over the next few years, that will get things done, that will have accomplishments, and there'll be much to be said for them. But we need, to the extent that we can give people the ability to integrate these disparate movements and better integrate the work of existing NGOs and institutions that we already have in place. And to the extent that we can take people that are already activists and let them work better, and to the extent that we can provide an ethos that will encourage other people who have never considered activism, which I was once one of those people, to the extent that we can say, this is your duty. This is you've come into a country that over the years, people like Emma Goldman, the early anarchist agitators, they worked in circumstances much worse than ours, with problems, in many cases, much larger than ours, in conditions far worse than the conditions even I faced in prison. And you can either take that and say, well, I'm just going to take what they've given us and take that hard work and sacrifices they made and just enjoy the benefits, or I'm going to think about that and decide that I'm going to likewise try to give something back. And when we get that ethos, when we get that brought to bear, when we get that in front of people at this time under these conditions, there are a number of people out there, if they're shown the way, who will get up and start organizing their own groups and start taking their civics into their own hands.
Yeah, it can be difficult to stay cognizant of this, but as we mentioned earlier before we got on camera, it really only has been a brief period of time that we have had these tools at our disposal. But whereas now we're all tethered to social media, or at least I am, and a lot of people who I'm sure watching are, it can seem almost banal at this point. It doesn't seem like anything that has this sense of newness or this sense of wonder even to it anymore, just because it's become so incorporated into our everyday lives. But it really is this incredible innovation that we're only just beginning to get a full handle on how to most effectively utilize, right? So, how do you, since you kind of came up in this world prior to your incarceration, how do you kind of remain appreciative of the tools that we've been afforded, while not necessarily being in kind of mindless awe of them, if that makes sense?
Well, there's always a period between the onset of a technology or new developments and the point at which we fully understand how to use it, or at least understand more than when it came out. You know, there's a period of experimentation. There's a period of trial and error, and we've had a lot of that. And the important thing now is to take advantage of that trial and error period. Is for people to actually go back and look at what's been accomplished by like these online groups, for instance. What has been used, you know, what has worked in the movements of the past 10 years in different countries, including ours, and what can be built upon. I mean, obviously, we have to start looking at fundamental issues of how this is organized, because if we can, you know, even if we think about how to make a 3 or 4% increase in, you know, our efficiency as activists, or you know, these incremental changes on a fundamental level obviously have massive repercussions over time. So we need to look at the fundamental questions so that the efforts, the potential that's there, because there's a great deal of potential that can be harnessed if we look at that particular question. Now, yeah, the onset of the social media networks, you know, people get used to certain practices, they get used to certain occurrences, and that's both good and bad. It could obviously desensitize people to developments, or at least make developments that are pretty profound. You know, sort of people forget about them, obviously, as they become part of common life. So there needs to be reminders that, look, we have these things now, and we've been kind of fooling around with them, but you've seen what they can do just in these silly endeavors like video game trolling, or you know, meetups and sort of thing. We've seen what they can do in these different aspects of our lives. Now let's give some hard thought to how these can be used to create a whole new civic situation. You know, we don't have to work within an existing institution in an environment that institution didn't evolve in. These are institutions that came about in an entirely different environment that we're still using because of inertia. You know, so and there'll be silly projects that come about. There'll be silly theories and ideas about, oh, you know, back when the internet started, you know, the global village, and this is all going to change all these things for the better, and we can't, you know, we can't simply dismiss everything else because people have been wrong on some aspects of this. That people are always wrong about certain aspects of a new development. We have to, you know, we have to sort of march on with what we've gained in terms of our experience, and we have to. And there's a great deal that's happened in the last 10 years that has not really yet been properly analyzed, even by people whose business is to analyze these new things. It would be a shame if we don't learn these lessons in a very actionable way, at least over the next year.
I want to touch a little bit on the experience of being in prison, because it's obviously something that most people are not going to experience themselves. And while you were incarcerated, you did end up writing for outlets like The Intercept, The Daily Beast, some others. Did you perceive yourself as being a chronicler, in a sense, of prison conditions, just because most prisoners are not going to have the writerly aptitude that you do? So did you feel any obligation in a way to kind of deploy those skills that you possess in that sort of unique environment, such that the wider public might become more aware of what it is to live that way?
At first I did, and then slowly I realized that no one really cares that much, and that there's really no point to chronicling even the most demonstrable, documented, systematic assaults on the civil liberties of prisoners. That became particularly clear in the last year or so, writing for The Intercept, and you know, we'd obtained documents. I had gone through the administrative remedy process by which prisoners are obligated to complete before they can go to the courts, regardless of what the civil rights violation is. If you're being beaten up on a daily basis, if you're being held illegally in the SHU for a period of years, regardless of what's been done to you, you have to go through this process. And this process is more or less entirely under the control of the same prison officials who you'd be setting out to sue. So we demonstrated how that process works. In my case, when my email was taken away illicitly after I used it to contact a journalist about misconduct by Bureau of Prison officials, and we documented the process over the next year, as even the BOP's own, you know, chief regional lawyers would do things like give me negative 15 days to respond to one of their replies, things that are indefensible, and that, you know, I hoped that having brought attention to those things, maybe, you know, we would get the degree of tension necessary, meet that threshold where, you know, the president could sign an executive order reforming that process, something he could have done very quickly. But we never quite reached that threshold, no matter how many interviews I gave, and no matter how many people, other inmates, put themselves at risk to give me that information or to speak out. So, you know, obviously the pressure becomes less at that point when you realize it's futile. You keep doing it because, you know, it's your obligation. But I didn't feel like, oh God, if I can only get this thing in, you know, this will change everything, because, you know, that was originally why I got involved with Anonymous to begin with, because journalism by itself just doesn't get the results that I want to see.
So as that futility became evident to you, did a sense of despair creep in? Did you have to ward that off? How did you maintain a sense of purpose even under those trying conditions?
No, you can live on hatred pretty easily. It sort of spurred me on to rethink, you know, when I get out, how can we create new systems of opposition? You know, how can we, you know, if I spend enough time on it, and if I talk to enough people, and talk to the right people and get these people integrated, how can I create an opposition network that will actually get these things done? Because I want to see them done, and I don't want to have to rely on my fellow journalists to get them done, because that's a losing formula right there. You know, how do we bypass our institutions and create new ones that will be effective? And that's, you know, at some point, you know, that was my new emphasis. You know, my attempts to reform prison, you know, they kind of came to a halt when the New York Times had accepted an op-ed in which I had summarized my findings, and they accepted that in September, and then all the election stuff happened, and they kept pushing it off, and, you know, I was hoping that would be the cornerstone of this big sort of push for prison reform, and then they didn't get back to me for a while, then they killed the piece. So it was my fault for dealing with the New York Times. After all, I've, you know, analyzed about it myself, you know, looking at their pundits and the kind of people they employ to do their opinion articles, and their history of being wrong about everything and their predictions. You know, I should never have sent it to the New York Times first, but I did. And so that's a good lesson right there about, you know, what needs to be done. We don't need to be in a position where we have to rely on eventually getting attention from one of these institutions. We have to be able to generate our own attention on our own grounds, and that's a difficult process, but, you know, it's less difficult than things that have been done before. It's not too much to shoot for, to hope that we can create something in which citizens are able to generate focus on those things that need to be focused upon, and not rely on this haphazard, this collection of broken institutions that have kind of we've inherited from a flawed and troubled history.
And are these themes that came up over the course of your incarceration with other inmates? Or that's another way of asking, how did you navigate those internal prison dynamics? You've talked about how these kind of informal economies sprout up. Where was your place in that kind of network?
I had an unusual, sort of amorphous, ambiguous position, just like I do in real life. You know, I was a high status inmate simply because of what I had done, how we had taken on the DOJ and the FBI, the stuff that Anonymous had done, stuff I had done. You know, they'd all read about me, you know, at some point, you know. So, you know, I did pretty well in prison. I had plenty of time to study things and kind of see how things work, and talk to people and listen to people's stories, and harass the administrations. And, you know, in one case, we had a little uprising back at the Seagoville jail unit after one of the guards threatened an old man, and that went very well. We went to the hole for 2 months for that, but you know, so I got to experiment a little bit with insurgency, you know, in a very interesting little test area where you're in the belly of the beast all day. You live in the government. You have all these people here who are, you know, unlike the massive American people, aren't cowards for the most part. You know, a lot of them are more sort of more willing to accommodate themselves to how things are, because they're in there for 20 years, you know, and they don't want to have their lives destroyed. So I understand their positions more than I understand the position of the average person who's a coward on the streets. But you know, so I tried to experience as much as I can, almost like a tourist, you know, and tried to take what I can from that experience, stuff that'll be, you know, useful to know on the outside during this period of change.
Did most people who you interact with exhibit virtue that maybe you internalize or are going to carry forth, and that could range from the fellow inmates to even some of the administrators of their guards. I mean, were there aspects of your engagement with them that are going to inform the way that you process information going forward?
There were a number of people that you really had to admire. I mean, there's extraordinary stories of people, you know, and some of this has come out. Like the New Yorker's been very good about covering these issues in the past couple of years of these inmates who they're being held in the SHU, they're being held in solitary, usually for bullshit causes. They're being harassed, but they're still involved with the Innocence Project. They're still helping other inmates write up the administration. They're enduring retaliation. They're you know, and you meet those people and you have to think, you know, that they're, you know, that I can't stop, you know, if they're not going to, and that's useful to see people like that right now, because you don't necessarily get a chance to interact with a lot of people of that caliber. Sometimes you do it anonymous, sometimes you do it, you know, in activism in general, sometimes in the press, but not for the most part. So, you know, that's helpful. There's always. These institutions are not monolithic, and we have to remember that. You know, obviously we know intellectually that an institution is made up of all these different people with different emotional impulses and agendas, but it's something important to keep in mind whenever you're dealing with an institution, especially if you're trying to destroy it, that there's always chinks in the armor. There's people there who disagree to some extent, and I obviously try to take advantage of that as much as possible in order to get information. That's why I was able to find out that I was listed as one of the 15 most notorious inmates at Three Rivers medium security prison, and that I was one of the ones they had to memorize the picture of every month, and I was listed under my photo or my name as a hacker, which I'm not, which not even the DOJ says I'm a hacker, but of course it would have been embarrassing for them to say he's a journalist, and the reason you have to know this guy is because he'll write about the criminal stuff we do. So so that's important, is that when you think of a cop, and you know, I despise most cops. I have no sympathy for cops in general, and that's unfortunately not a viewpoint that gets expressed enough. People who talk about the police situation generally haven't had to deal with them for the most part. Or you have black leaders come on and it's perceived as a racial issue. It's not perceived as a nationwide civil rights issue. White people start writing it off like, oh, the blacks are complaining again. When, you know, you have this massive fundamental problem about how we engage our citizenry. What armed men are allowed to interact with our people in what ways, you know, de facto and officially. So you meet cops in a prison, you deal with them, you become friends with some of them, which is unusual for me. And some of them do go to the trouble to do the right thing. Most of them, and this is across the board, most of them, even when they know what the right thing is and sympathize with you, they will follow orders. And that's something else that's important. You know, I was held in the SHU for about 6 months altogether of my 4-year sentence. On the most recent occasion, I was held there entirely illegally with contrary to policy for 2 weeks.
Just define the SHU briefly.
SHU is a special housing unit, and that's when people talk about the whole or solitary confinement, they're usually referring to that designation. That's when you're held 23 to 24 hours a day, locked down in a cell, either by yourself or with another roommate. They feed you through a hole in the door. You know, you get, in some places they have showers in there, other places you have to go down the hall. They vary from institution to institution and system to system, but it's all generally, you know, 23-hour, 24-hour day lockdown. And when you walk out to go to recreation, you know, you're chained up. You got leg irons. So the last 2 weeks there, you know, I was put in the SHU because I had refused to meet with an administration official at the prison that I was in the process of trying to sue. I wouldn't meet with them, and they threw me in the SHU and put me for disobeying an order, and then I was given a sentence of 2 weeks, suspended sentence of commissary restriction, and instead the assistant warden held me in the SHU because he was mad at me because I had insulted him. So, and you know, the guys who work in the SHU, you know, in my case, they're very sympathetic to my case and to what I do, but you know, when it comes down to it, if it's any undue inconvenience for them, that's their chief. That's what they're thinking about. They're not thinking about, hey, is this wrong? Is this extraordinarily a violation of what this country supposedly stands for? You know, but they're not going to take a bullet for you, and that has to be kept in mind when we give this undue praise as a society just reflexively to our armed forces or to our police officers. We have to actually know what kind of people partially make up these groups. You know, I've had an unusual degree of contact with cops, and ex-military just because of my bizarre upbringing. Many of them are fine people, but we have to, we can't gloss over these engines, these potential engines for fascism that exist, because fascism always draws upon the armed forces and the police to a considerable extent. We have to know what these people are willing to do when it comes down to it. That might come up in the next few years.
Was there an insult that you leveled at a person in authority that stands out to you as especially warranted, or one that really hit home quite a bit that you look back on with fondness?
Yeah, there was a warden, this bizarre guy who gave this long speech about, "You are all of my children." And what else did he say? He said, I used to be a case manager, and I was a fantastic one. I was an outstanding case manager, and I'm warden because I've earned it. This long half-an-hour speech, pacing back and forth like a South American dictator, 100 years ago. And I just wrote about the speech and all the crazy things he said, and how none of the guards liked him, and blah blah blah, and put it under his name. So hopefully that'll be the top Google result for his name for forever. So I enjoyed that. For the most part, I really didn't go after individuals. I was more interested in entertaining people, frankly. I had to build up a readership. I had to charm people, and I had to do what I can to get the readers there so that I could then, point out a few things here and there about here's how prisons work. So it wasn't really a situation in which I had the luxury of being able to go after people just for the sake of going after them. If I could integrate it into the piece in a funny way that, worked with the other material, then yeah, I would do it. But for the most part, I don't have the luxury of revenge anymore, I'm afraid.
So my thought upon hearing the news of your release was that some publication should dispatch you to work as a White House correspondent. I thought that's the role you would be most suited to, but as it stands now, you are covering the Dallas City Council for D Magazine. Yeah,
I had to get a 40-hour-a-week job, and usually I don't work in offices as a staff writer, but I had to do it for the next 4 months for my halfway house. Actually worked out much better than I thought it would, simply because Dallas right now is in a bizarre situation, has a number of scandals that have gone national. All of the city council members are up for election this year for the first time in Dallas history. And there's demographic changes that have taken place in the last 10, 15 years that really allow us an opportunity to actually get this government changed on the city level. And of course, it may be over the next several years necessary for a base to be built in the cities of efficient, reasonable, honest, moral government. That might become necessary, for the national pursuits. So, among other things, will be the system I'm putting together, the civic platform called the Pursuant System, which I've described a bit, and which was discussed in the Wired profile a few months ago. One of our pilot projects for that will be a Dallas Pursuance, as in we'll be channeling people here. We'll be sort of integrating existing activists and recruiting on a large scale, just young people in this city and anyone else who wants to participate. And sort of experiment a little bit, see how we can, see what works and what doesn't over the next year or so.
Right. As to your coverage of the workings of the city council, it's amusing because you write with sort of a surrealist flair, let's say, and when somebody ordinarily goes and seeks out coverage of local municipal government, most of the time it's very bland, very uneventful. And to throw you into that environment is kind of funny in its own right. Is that one of the reasons why you were dispatched into that arena?
Yeah, I think so. I think they knew what would come of it, and it has come. Luckily there's several council members who are just abject cretins. Just extraordinarily, they're not the worst. The worst one in Dallas was a number of years ago. There was a guy who gave a speech about this local Boy Scout who had been building bat houses in the park, and he wore a vampire teeth and a cape, and denounced the Boy Scout as Dracula because he's bringing bats, and our parks are for people, not flying mice, and the bats might attack people. And that was our city councilman in one of our areas here. So that gives you a sense of the potential, comedically and otherwise, for this assignment. So, on top of that, I really, again, just because of what's going on in the city right now, what's going on nationally, there's much more potential here on a policy level than normally. And plus, I want to learn a little bit more how cities are run. That's going to come up in some of the things I'll be doing over the next few years anyway.
In one of the dispatches, you speculate that Mayor Mike Rawlings of Dallas could be under the spell of the occult, which sounds plausible to me.
Oh, no, no, I referred to the occult occurrence of upscale corruption. I just meant occult in the sense of hidden.
Right.
No, I don't think he's involved in the occult. I think I would like him more if he was.
And then there's another councilwoman by the name of Arnold, who you've kind of exalted into this sort of comedic foil in a way, just because she's always, quote, discombobulated. Are you seen as now a pest to these people?
Yes. There's a couple that like me quite a bit. One of them actually was a supporter of mine during my case early on and tweeted about me and all that. So I have, you might call allies on the council, in the sense that we have areas of agreement, probably more so than I normally would with a council member of a major city. But yeah, for the most part, I think they would prefer that I not be there writing about the things that they're saying and doing, yes.
Right.
But you know, hopefully that's always the case when you have a journalist.
Right. So even though you're not physically incarcerated at this point, you still are under the thumb of the state. Is that inhibiting your movements in a way that you find debilitating at all, or is it kind of in keeping with what you'd want to be doing anyway at this stage?
Well, I mean, on paper, I'm a big, anarchist and all that, and hate the government. But in practice, I'm kind of a homebody anyway. Like, I don't like running around doing errands. So, I mean, I really don't mind a lot of the oppression. It just happens to go with, how I operate anyway. So it's not a huge deal. I mean, it's, there's really nowhere I want to go in Dallas, frankly. So, yeah, it's not a big deal. I mean, it's the usual stuff with me,
Right. Once these restrictions are eased, is there somewhere where you envision yourself going, whether it's in the United States or abroad? If you could, throw a dart at a map, I mean, where do you conceive of yourself being?
Well, I'm not going to go back to Brooklyn. I'll tell you that. Probably not Austin either. Yeah, I don't know yet. That's still up in the air. That's going to depend on a couple of projects that are underway. That might help to determine that, but I have no solid plans. I don't like to make plans in advance. I like to kind of just flow along with the wind, like a little leaf on the winds of history.
I can relate to that. People get too immersed in projections about the future when
That's right.
the present is as wild as you could hope for. So
and the future has gotten rather chaotic lately, so it's very hard to do that. So.
Right. Okay, then. I think this was an edifying interview. It was for me. Hopefully viewers agree. Thank you, Barrett Brown.
Thank you very much, sir.